In Update 2.5 Ixwa Strike, Hyuga got a complete rework by IJN. The firepower and armor of the ship received extensive upgrades, so it performed significantly differently than it did before. There were also various changes to Naval's damage models, so it's worth going back over. I already covered Hyuga's history in the original view, so I'll get right into it this time. Hyuga has 12 356mm, 14-inch, 45 caliber cannons split into 6 turrets. These turrets are in 3 separate super firing pairs, one facing towards the bow, and 2 pairs facing backwards amidships and at the stern. These cannons have identical dispersion to all other battleship cannons, along with a peak reload of 30 seconds like most of the others. Hyuga gets 2 shell types, SAP and APCBC. The SAP replaced the HE shell that was present in Update 2.3, which is the main reason that the ship is performing so differently than it was before. The SAP shell has the exact same filler of almost 70 kilograms of HE as the previous shell, making it the single most destructive shell in War Thunder. These SAP shells provide the highest raw damage against all targets. Even against a ship with enough armor to stop the shell, it's still going to deal massive amounts of damage due to the large amount of filler. As for the APCBC shell, it has a lot more pen but less filler. It's still very destructive, but worse in most situations since it just deals so much less damage. Overall, I would suggest running the SAP shell in almost all situations. If you're trying to precisely hit an ammo rack on a battleship, the APCBC shell can be a bit better, but it is generally inferior for damage output. For secondaries, Hyuga gets 20 140mm, 5.5-inch, 50 caliber Type 41 cannons, and 6 7.72mm Lewis machine guns. The Type 41 cannons can get 10 barrels onto a single target in a broadside and have a peak fire rate of 10 shells per minute, which is half of what it was last patch. IJN fixed secondaries having a doubled reload rate, so this applies to everything, not just this ship. The Type 41 cannon can single-handedly hold off destroyers or smaller ships, letting the player save salvos from their main cannons for much larger and more threatening targets. They can also fire on low-flying aircraft, so the only planes they'll be hitting are torpedo bombers. It only gets SAP ammunition, which is effective against destroyers and smaller cruisers. It quickly falls off against more armored targets, however. The Lewis machine guns aren't particularly effective due to their extremely low damage output, but it's still something to pressure nearby aircraft, which is more than can be said for some dreadnoughts. Don't expect it to deter heavy bombers, but against very predictable torpedo bombers, it can wreck their engine or even get a lucky pilot snipe. Last up for Hyuga's weaponry comes its secondary ordnance, 6 Type 43 torpedoes mounted in 6 underwater torpedo tubes with 3 on each side of the ship. These have poor overall stats due to being World War I era torpedoes, and generally just aren't worth using, as they're torpedoes mounted on a battleship. In survivability, Hyuga is much different from the previous version. The entire armor layout of the ship was reworked from scratch, making it significantly different from before. While there are still some missing parts, particularly around the magazines, it's far better than the 2.3 version of Hyuga, primarily from the weak points in the belt being fixed. The belt maxes out at 299mm and covers a lot of the ship's midsection, along with various smaller plates and cull bunkers providing more survivability. The upper belt is 199mm, helping protect more of the ship's citadel. It also has a turtleback scheme beneath that, giving the Hyuga excellent protection against crew damage. For its ammunition, Hyuga is a bit more vulnerable. On the front and back magazines at certain angles, only a 56mm plate protects the ammunition, which means that Hyuga isn't particularly hard to cripple or kill with a good shot. Luckily, shell rooms no longer cause instant deaths upon getting hit. However, the magazines are very exposed, and both the front and rear magazines are very easy to hit and detonate. High caliber shells can easily hit Hyuga underwater and one-shot it, and it's relatively vulnerable to bombs and torpedoes compared to lots of other dreadnoughts. The turrets are also oddly vulnerable, shooting them deals tons of damage and can even cause ammo detonations. The armor scheme gives Hyuga more protection than any cruiser, but is mediocre when put alongside other battleships. In general, it's pretty resilient to crew damage, but the exposed and poorly protected ammunition makes it very easy to detonate the ammo of the ship if it comes up against someone that knows what they're doing or is just a bit lucky. Last up for vehicle stats, mobility. With a top speed of 44 km per hour, or 23.8 knots, Hyuga is the fastest battleship in game, but still slow relative to most cruisers and battlecruisers. It struggles to effectively push gap zones or reach the enemy's convoy in encounter missions, though this mobility disadvantage doesn't really give it a problem on conquest maps. For the overall playstyle of Hyuga, it's like every other battleship for the most part. High survivability, excels at brawling or sniping, vulnerable to aircraft with large explosive loads, you get the idea. It has far more damage output than its competition, so it can kill enemy battleships far faster than most other ships can. Cruisers still struggle a bit, as many of them can't reach the ammunition, especially lower tier ones. Hyuga can even face Kuma and Sendai, who have the exact same main gun that Hyuga has for secondaries, and far less of them. Out of every battleship, Hyuga is most similar to Poltava or Maria, putting out excessively high damage output compared to its competition. The extremely high power shells and the high survivability against most ship types makes Hyuga very easy to use and renders its lack of mobility almost irrelevant. The only vehicles that can give it some equal competition are other battleships. Cruisers and destroyers are hopelessly outmatched, so none of them provide a real threat. It's one of the only battleships that can easily kill other battleships in direct combat, since Hyuga's overwhelming firepower gives it a massive edge in damage output. As for weaknesses, those come in the form of torpedoes and large bombers. To deal with torpedoes, just change headings occasionally. A small shift can cause a salve of long-range torpedoes to miss, so try to avoid going in the same direction for more than 2 or 3 minutes or getting overly close to a destroyer. Dealing with large bombers is simultaneously more difficult and requires a lot less effort. Just don't get targeted. Easy, right? Since Hyuga lacks any form of effective anti-air weaponry and is a giant high-priority target, it's constantly attacked by revenge casts. The only way to really deter them is by sticking near allied cruisers, particularly ships with high anti-air loadouts such as USS Baltimore, but even then a high-altitude bomber can just stroll up and drop its ordnance before it even gets into range of their anti-air, so just try not to shoot at Prinzeugans since they usually have a pocket Ju-288 for revenge bombing. So, is Hyuga worth getting? It's the best battleship in the game for raw damage output, so if you like how battleships are, it might as well be worth getting since it just deals more damage than the others. It's still excessively boring even with its high damage output, just like every other battleship currently, so that's a mark against it. Its lineup is a bit odd. Setsu and Ikoma aren't great as far as capital ships go, but Tone, Mogami, and Suzuya are excellent 5.7 cruisers with torpedoes that can be very effective against enemy battleships. It also takes a bit to reach since Suzuya and Mogami are placed before Hyuga, meaning that they need to be unlocked first. Luckily, those two ships are pretty good, so it's not a total waste. Hyuga should maintain its value for a while. It'll stay relevant against lots of new ships due to the sheer power of its SAP shells, so it's a safe bet to unlock, unless Gaijin makes another absurdly large jumping capability. For mods, I would suggest an order of toolset, fire protection system, rudder replacement, ventilation, shrapnel protection, propeller replacement, ammo wetting, and new pumps. For crew skills leadership, main caliber reload speed, crew interchangeability, fire prevention, ship control, and the various damage control skills. Thank you for watching.